Hi there, it's Larold, and today I'm making a video about Evokers and their new hero talent tree, Chronowarden. So when Evoker was first announced, I was super excited because I hoped they might get a tank spec. It sort of seemed possible. A big scaly dragon tank seems like a great idea. You mitigate damage with your scales and black dragon spells, you heal back up and deal damage with red dragon spells, and then you use bronze spells as your cooldowns. It's perfect, and I was all ready. Then Blizzard announced augmentation, and that was a real curveball. I was already comfortable with Devastation, so I naturally played Augmentation, and I really fell in love, but tanking is like a prison. I can't just go to Mythic Raid one week and say, hey, I'd like to take this week off as tank so that I can play Augmentation. So what that really leaves for me in terms of in-game content as an Evoker, I don't know. Like, pug heroic raids and run random Mythic Plus? Pretty much. So I did that, and I loved it. I had a lot of fun. It felt like one of those days where you skip school to go to Six Flags or something. I even made a couple of guides for augmentation, but I never felt comfortable putting them out because I'm a tank guy. But whatever, new expansion, new me. I like augmentation and I play it in a totally unorganized set of content, but I'm still good at other stuff in the game, so I sort of know what I'm talking about. And with that being said, let's take a look at the Chronowarden tree. Alright, so here we have the Chronowarden tree, and first things first, let's take a look at this diagram in the top right corner to kind of look at the other hero talent tree setups that are available to Evoker. So Augmentation and Preservation have this overlap of Chronowarden, Augmentation and Devastation have Scale Commander, and Devastation and Preservation have Ruby Adept. Now I think Ruby Adept is obviously going to be leaning on more of the fire damage. Scale Commander, I don't know, maybe more Black Dragon damage, maybe more of a defensive setup, more cooldown oriented, no way to really know, but Augmentation and Preservation lining up with the Chronowarden really leans in on the Bronze Dragon effect, more damage echoing and buffing your allies, more damage over time stuff, and just more emphasis on your cooldowns. And now let's start with Chronoflame. And this is the first talent, kind of the one that gives us the indication of how the whole tree is going to go, and I think it really does. Chronoflame. Living Flame is enhanced by Bronze Magic, repeating 15% of the damage or healing you dealt to the target in the last 5 seconds as arcane, up to a fixed amount. Now this has a cap, but ultimately this is not 15% more damage from Living Flame or healing from Living Flame. That was kind of how I read it initially. It is just a 15% total damage echo, sort of like kind of like a version of the old Death Strike where, you heal for, well, I guess current Death Strike even, where you heal for a percent of the damage, but this is just echoing the damage that you've already dealt, so it turns Living Flame from being a kind of not great damage filler spell into a bit more of a damage cooldown, sort of very minor one, and that has really good overlap with the talent Leaping Flames. So you can use Fire Breath, you even use Tip the Scales just to get a very quick max empower Fire Breath. You throw that onto a pack of enemies, and now instead of your Living Flame hitting 1 target baseline or 2 targets with Pupil of Alexstrasza, you're getting like 5 targets hit with Living Flame. And the thing that's nice about this is that it isn't just enemies. Let's say you're only fighting 1 enemy or 2 enemies. If you have 5 targets that your Living Flame is going to hit, it will choose to also heal people. It's a pretty smart and well-designed spell for being kind of a crappy filler skill. So getting more damage and healing on packs of enemies is pretty nice. Now, that being said, 15% more damage for an Aug Evoker, not a lot of damage. And that is sort of the downside here. I think this has clearly a lot more value for Preservation Evoker in terms of just raw throughput numbers. Preservation's going to do a lot more healing and damage than Augmentation is healing and damage. But still, I think this is a cool concept. Now, maybe this is one of those things that should be tuned a little differently between the two specs, where it does like 30% for Aug and 15% for Pres, but as it is right now, I think the design is pretty cool. Over here on the left, we have Warp, which just changes Hover into Blink. This is pretty amazing. It also reduces the cooldown. Now, Warp is... I mean, I like Hover a lot, and it basically just gives you the same functionality, except it functions like a Blink instead of like... Hover right now kind of works like Chi Torpedo. It's a big burst of damage and also a follow-up move speed buff, but then it also lets you cast while moving, which is pretty nice. And Warp has all of that, except now you can use it to like skip over lines on the ground, that sort of thing. So this just on its own seems like it's something that's going to be very abusable for Encounter strategies, you know, the idea that you can like conjure a Wearing Stone as an Aug Evoker, bestow a Wearing Stone onto somebody, then teleport over some sort of death line, and then they can teleport to you with the Wearing Stone. That's pretty interesting. I don't know exactly how valuable that'll be in Mythic Plus, but in Raid, there seems like that, you know, fight specifics notwithstanding, there could definitely be some value there. And then in PvP, this seems pretty rad. Temporal Burst makes Tip the Scales overload you with temporal energy, increasing your haste, movement speed, and cooldown recovery rate by 2%, ramping up to 40% over 20 seconds. Now, we don't know exactly what the ramp up rate is. Like, if this ramps up so that the very last, like, 1 second of having the buff, it's worth 40%, this means it would be average of about 20% more haste, move speed, and cooldown recovery rate over those 20 seconds. Now, that actually winds up not being all that much cooldown recovery rate. I think it shaves like 8 seconds or something off of Tip the Scales. I mathed this all out at some point. That being said, Tip the Scales is a really cool cooldown. Like, I really like the concept of it. It's real nice quality of life. But the throughput value, the actual value of it, is very low. All it really does is it shaves like a very brief period of time off of the amount of wind up you need to empower a Fire Breath. So instead of having to sit there and empower for like a quick AoE pull, like for several seconds, you can press Tip the Scales and hit Fire Breath while you're moving. That's great, but like as for empowering Upheaval, all that empowering Upheaval does is make it a larger AoE radius, which is, I mean, it can be useful if mobs are really scattered around, but that's rarely ever useful. So you pretty much only ever use it on Fire Breath, and then the real main value is just to get all that juice from Leaping Flames, to max out the value of your Leaping Flames, while not having to sit there and waste basically 2 seconds of empower time. You know, we're talking 1 living flame cast that you can fit into that. So not really a lot of value out of baseline Tip the Scales, and this adds quite a bit of quality of life to it. The move speed, I think, is particularly underrated, but even so, 20 seconds of on average 20% haste, sort of like a mini Bloodlust. That's pretty cool. One thing that I think is really a little weird here is that this is very backloaded. So you start out 2% haste, move speed, cooldown recovery, and it ends at 40%, which means that you're zipping around. You're moving at plus 40% move speed, plus 40% haste, and then it all falls off, and then now you have none of that. It's sort of the opposite of the way that these things usually function, where it's all super front-loaded, and then it gradually falls off, and you don't have this sudden drop in power that's kind of sucks at the end of the buff. But, you know, that's okay. Either way, I think this is a very cool concept that adds a lot of much needed value to a really nice quality of life cooldown that actually kind of sucks. Reverberations just makes it so that Spirit Bloom, which is sort of your main empower heal, is preservation. I know that much at least, I looked that up. And then Upheaval, which is sort of one of your main empower skills, along with Fire Breath, they deal 30% extra damage over 8 seconds. Now, as an Aug Evoker, again, Upheaval's damage just isn't that much. So juicing that damage by a lot still doesn't really, I mean, it's a multiplier on a very small number. It's just not that much more damage. Interdimensional Phase and Motes of Acceleration are a choice node over here on the left. Interdimensional Phase makes it so that Warp, this buffed version of Hover, now also gives you a damage reduction effect. It's very high for like being hacked onto a really valuable blink, 30%. But, you know, it only lasts for 2 seconds. So I really think this is mostly a PvP thing. You could potentially use this for dealing with some mechanics in like Mythic Plus and Raid. You know, you're going to get targeted by some hard-hitting thing, or you know that some sort of like a Shadow Bolt Nova on the final boss in Black Rook Hold is coming. You can warp half a second before it hits and take 30% less damage. That's pretty good. The alternative is Warp leaving a trail of motes of acceleration. Motes of acceleration leaves motes of acceleration. All right, whatever. Allies who come in contact with one of these motes of acceleration gain 20% increased move speed for 30 seconds. This is a pretty interesting design. So usually move speed increases in WoW, I mean, almost invariably move speed increases in WoW are high amounts of move speed for a short period of time. Dash is 60% move speed for 10 seconds. Tiger's Lust is 70 for 6. Stampeding Roar is 60% for 8. Like, they're usually 6 to 10 seconds of move speed and then 60 to 80% worth of move speed. Divine Steed, 100% for 3 to 5 seconds. This is almost the exact opposite. It's a small amount of move speed, 20%, not huge, but enough to help you dodge a lot of mechanics, and then it lasts for 30 seconds. Well, Hover's base cooldown is 25, I think that's with talents, and then with Warp it goes all the way down to 20, and the buff lasts for 30 seconds. Now, we don't know exactly how many motes of acceleration you're going to drop out, but it says a trail. I would assume that's like 3 to 5. So you could potentially have a move speed buff. I don't know that you're going to be using Warp on cooldown to give people a 20% move speed buff all the time, but you could. You could use Warp on cooldown to give your group a 20% move speed buff all the time, and that's pretty amazing quality of life. Really helps with dodging lots of mechanics, or even just more basic stuff like breaking and tangling roots. Threads of Fate makes it so that casting an Essence ability during Temporal Burst, that Temporal Burst being that buff from Tip the Scales, causes a nearby ally to gain a Thread of Fate for 15 seconds, granting them a chance to echo their damage or healing spells, dealing 15% of that amount again. This is perfectly thematic with Augmentation Evoker. This is exactly like all the echoing of damage that you get, stuff from, say, Prescience and Fate Mirror. This is basically just that redesigned again. The difference is, of course, that it's in this 20-second window that occurs on a 2-minute cooldown, slightly less than 2 minutes, more like a minute and 10, what is it, a minute and 50-second cooldown, I think, on average, minute and 45 that you're going to get thanks to the cooldown recovery from Temporal Burst itself. But yeah, it's not a ton. That being said, you do, after using Tip the Scales, you are going to be hitting several eruptions in a row, so you're going to be spreading this Thread of Fate out to several allies. Assuming that you're able to have this on more than one person at a time, you're probably going to be putting this on, 3 or 4, or I mean, basically the whole group in a Mythic Plus. And that is not bad. Additionally here, Primacy, you just get some haste. Basically, when you cast Upheaval, you get a damage over time effect from reverberations on each enemy you hit, and so as long as you hit 3 enemies or more, you're going to get 9% haste. Nothing wrong with it, just pretty simple, but it is what Augmentation Evokers crave. Now here we have Careful Contemplation and Time Convergence. Now in my opinion, I think Careful Contemplation is kind of bait. It is 10% more intellect and stamina, but it's also 10% increased cooldowns. I think this winds up making you worse. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is totally fine. You do have a lot of cooldown reduction built into your kit. Each time you cast Eruption, it reduces the cooldown of Upheaval, but still, like, we're talking about Upheaval having a baseline 44-second cooldown instead of 40. Tip the Scales having I guess a 2-minute and 12-second base cooldown instead of 2 minutes. Like, that sucks. Time Convergence, on the other hand, abilities with a 45-second or longer cooldown grant 10% intellect for 15 seconds. Defensive abilities grant 10% stamina for 15 seconds. Essence spells extend the duration by 1 second. So there aren't a ton of super long cooldowns as an Augmentation Evoker. You have Deep Breath, or I guess Breath of Eons. You have, you have your Bloodlust. I guess that'd count, and that's something. You'll definitely be able to extend that buff for a while during Bloodlust. You have Tip the Scales. You have, what are they called? Obsidian Scales. You have a handful of cooldowns that are longer than 45 seconds, but not all that many. That being said, I still think that this is better just purely because it doesn't come with a downside of making all your cooldowns longer. I think that playing with the longer cooldown setup is an option. I think it's real forgiving and easy, and definitely the weaker of the two options in higher end play, but if you're just being super casual about it, I think Careful Contemplation could be useful. I mean, 10% more stamina is good for living through stuff, and 10% more intellect is good for transferring stats to other people with Ebb and Might. So not all downside, but I do think the downside of this kind of is pretty unappealing to me, and the gameplay aspect of maintaining that time convergence buff with using your Eruption sounds pretty appealing to me. It sounds pretty fun. It basically just becomes like a multiplier on the way you're already supposed to play the class. You have your Ebb and Might that you're maintaining with Upheaval and Eruption, and now you're also getting to maintain this extra buff that makes Ebb and Might even stronger. Sounds pretty good. Now let's look at Master of Destiny and Golden Opportunity. Master of Destiny empowers spells amplify all your active Threads of Fate, increasing their power by 100% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 2 times. This is a bit of an interesting spell here because you use Temporal Burst, Tip the Scales, and then the idea is that you would immediately use an Empower spell. Fire Breath, basically. Then you would want to cast Essence abilities to get Temporal Bursts out on your nearby allies, so you would be spamming Eruption over and over again. but you don't want to just sit there and spam Eruption unless Upheaval's on cooldown. So you want to have Upheaval on cooldown and then spam Eruption, but then you also want to use Upheaval so that you can empower those Threads of Fate. So I think the idea here is that you would tip the scales, Fire Breath, Upheaval, and then spam Eruption a whole bunch, and that would get your Threads of Fate all over all your allies. Then when the Threads of Fate are, or I guess so I should say when the Temporal Burst is nearing its end, you would try to get that Upheaval out and I guess Breath of Fire back out and try and buff those Threads of Fate. I don't know, there's kind of some weird stuff happening here. Maybe this is just an incentive for Augmentation Evokers to, instead of running Interwoven Threads, to run Time Skip and then Tomorrow Today, so that you have the ability to use Tip the Scales and use your Empower spells and kind of get those out and then have them back up to use them again to buff the Threads of Fate that you've put out. I don't know. There's certainly a bit of a weird design here. I think this seems very raid oriented if you're going to use Time Skip. I think this could be really good for maximizing a huge burst window, but it is a bit strange. The alternative is just Golden Opportunity. Prescience has a 25% chance to not incur a cooldown. That's a lot more straightforward. You could just put more Presciences out. In Mythic Plus, a tank is not going to be upset about having a Prescience. If you really do get like a bunch of cooldown, I guess not occurring on Prescience and you're able to put it out on the tank even, they're gonna get more damage. It's gonna add up to quite a bit in an AoE situation for a fairly good tank anyway. And even if that's not the case, being able to just maintain Prescience on all of the DPS in the group or more DPS in a raid, I think that's very appealing and a lot more straightforward than Master of Destiny, which is a cool concept but sort of seems a little combative with itself. Like if instead of it amplifying the power of the Threads of Fate, it like increased their duration or something, so you had sort of a justification of as the Threads of Fate are getting close to expiring, you could then hit more Empower spells and re-extend them all the way out to their base duration. I think there would be something there. I don't know, this is a very weird design with Master of Destiny, whereas Golden Opportunity, pretty straightforward. And then Echo, I know that that's a preservation healing spell. Having it not cost essence so you can cast it some more, that's a good thing. I don't really have any more of a strong opinion than that, but I do think it's cool. Now, in interacting with Master of Destiny, we have Instability Matrix over here. Each time you cast an Empower spell, Unstable Time Magic reduces its cooldown by up to 15 seconds. So if you're hitting Tip the Scales and Breath of Firing, and you get the full value of Instability Matrix and it's a 15-second cooldown, it goes from 30 all the way down to 15, then you would be able to Breath of Fire again during Threads of Fated, Master of Destiny. And maybe that is the intended interaction here, is that you're going to get really good luck on all your cooldown reduction on all your Empower spells, and you're going to be able to cast them again during the time when Threads of Fate, Temporal Burst is going. I think there is something there, and maybe in conjunction with also running Time Skip, maybe you have something going on there. I don't know. It's something to think about. Certainly it's interesting. I just wonder, like, how often is this going to give 15 seconds versus 3 or 1? And there's really no way to know until we could get into the game and test. And finally, we have After Image. Empower spells send up to 3 Chrono Flames to your targets. Chrono Flames have a small chance to grant you Essence Burst. Now, it's kind of weird that we haven't seen anything interacting with Chrono Flame all the way from the start of the tree here. Living Flame is enhanced with Bronze Magic, repeating 15% of the damage and healing you did to the target in the last 5 seconds, blah, 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 blah. We don't see anything interacting with that at all until the very end, where it's just, hey, when you cast Breath of Fire or Fire Breath and Upheaval, you'll also throw out a bit of extra single target damage juice. And maybe you get some Essence Bursts. That's cool. It does seem a little disconnected because I feel like there's a lot of connection between these talents here. Temporal Burst, Threads of Fate, Master of Destiny, and Instability Matrix, those all interact. Reverberations and Primacy interact. They even interact with those other 4. So there's a lot of interaction between all the talents in the middle of the tree, and I think that all really comes together nicely. It's kind of weird that the top and bottom talents in this tree really don't interact with each other. I guess After Image, since it interacts with Empower spells and you're getting a lot of Empower spell cooldown reduction and Empower spell damage buff and Empower spell overlap with Tip the Scales getting juiced. I suppose that there is some value between this bottom talent and these ones here, but unlike all of the other talent trees that we've seen, where the top and bottom talents tend to be the defining attribute, in this one they seem to be more like the little bit of salt that's sprinkled on the end, and all the real value and juice is here in the middle. That being said, you know, free essence burst procs when you cast your empower spells. That's good. Free extra damage, that's good. It does overlap with the extra damage that you get out of reverberation, so that's something. Now, we don't really know how much more damage this is all going to add. It is being added onto Augmentation Evoker, so it's probably not going to be a lot, and maybe it could stand to be tuned up a bit. I think, again, if these were all preservation numbers, you know, the damage and healing increases were all relative to preservation, and then they just, and then they doubled it, Blizzard style, for augmentation, I think that would probably be the right move. But that being said, all the design I think is really appealing. I think just warp alone is like super, super cool. But then you have cooldown reduction and haste, you have move speed, you have more haste, you have more buffs for allies, which is awesome. You have even more cooldown reduction, and you have bonuses for using big cooldowns. Like, I think this all works really well. I think it definitely lives up to the name. A lot of cooldown reduction and haste. That's exactly what you would expect from a Chronowarden. The only real downside to any of this, I have to say, is that I can't tank with it. But it still looks really fun, and I definitely like what I see. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.